I'm just making a little bit of time here. We'll let people get settled in and make sure that they're hearing okay. I'll go ahead and mention a few things that you want to keep in mind. You're muted as guests, and we do, however, encourage lots of questions. So please type your questions into the Q&A section of Zoom and not the chat if that's available to you. Maybe it's not even available to you, but put it in the Q&A. We're being live streamed on Facebook and on YouTube right now. So we're reaching a larger audience. And tonight, let me get some information here. Tonight's talk will be with a couple of folks from Santa Barbara Audubon Society. They're going to give some background on interesting birds and bird habitat within Santa Barbara County and highlight some recent conservation work that uses data and discusses how that data can help restoration efforts into the future. Our presenters tonight are Jesse Allstadt, board member and chair of the Conservation Science Committee. Jesse has been a member and chair of the Conservation Science Committee of Santa Barbara Audubon since 2017. The committee oversees an important data tool, the breeding bird study. Very interesting. I've used that many times. It's a public access database of bird breeding records, which Jesse will be talking about tonight. Oh, goody. That's going to be interesting. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Catherine Emery, the Santa Barbara Audubon Society Executive Director. Yay, Executive Directors. Catherine, yeah, well, anyway, I'm biased. Catherine loves learning about birds and brings 20 plus years of local experience in teaching, research, education, and science to the Santa Barbara chapter of Santa Barbara Audubon Society. A little redundant there, sorry. Also, I want to let you know that this webinar will be made available on our website at Channel Islands Restoration, cirweb.org/webinars, within a few days of this presentation. And all of our webinars are available on there. There's a treasure trove of a couple of years worth of really interesting, I think we're going into 3 years now, very interesting talks by a lot of different people on a lot of different cool subjects that I know are of interest to folks here locally. So again, you want to, if you have a question, we want to hold those to the end, but feel free to start typing them in right now. I'm going to curate them to make sure that we don't have multiple questions of the same type being asked and that kind of thing. But feel free to jump on in and make this as interactive as it can with your fingers and typing. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that we are all living in the unceded territory of the Chumash people, this amazing place that we live. With that, I will turn it over to Catherine. You can go ahead and share your screen, or I guess Jesse, you're sharing the screen.
Yes.
You're in control of the PowerPoint, but then we'll hear from Catherine. Great, looks good.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for having us here. I am thrilled to be here, and it is great to give this presentation about who we are, what we do, and how community science can help protect birds and their habitat. So this is Jesse Allstadt and myself. We're both the Santa Barbara Audubon Society. And thank you again for having us. I'm going to go ahead and give a very brief outline of the talk. We're going to discuss who we are, why birds are important, what's special about Santa Barbara, and what do we do? Educational outreach, conservation science. We're going to do a deep dive on some of our conservation science outreach, including the breeding bird study. and briefly summarize about how you can get involved and help. So who's Santa Barbara Audubon? We're a local 501(c) nonprofit who works to protect birds and their habitats. We're an active California chapter of National Audubon, and we've been working hard for 60 years. In fact, this is our 60th anniversary year. So what's our mission? Well, our mission is to protect area bird life and habitat and connect people with birds through education, conservation, and science. We're volunteer driven. We have approximately 1,100 members in the Santa Barbara area, and we welcome all birders, expert and new birders. Where are we? Some people ask me. Well, we're in the field, we're birding. We're also at the Audubon Aviary, which is housed at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History backyard. And we're also at public meetings using science to inform decisions. So why are birds important? Well, they disperse seeds, they pollinate plants, they control pests, they save trees, clean up, balance the ecosystem, and provide joy. And what's special about Santa Barbara? I hear someone giggling, so that's good. Well, we have incredible habitat diversity, and I'm sure everyone on this call loves to be out in nature, so that's why you're here, which is great. We have beaches, we have forests, we have mountains, we have sloughs. We're also in the Pacific Flyway, which is one of the 4 main migratory pathways in North America. We are so lucky. We have vibrant bird migration activity because of that. Birds go north, they go south, some. We also have a really active group of birders and over 500 different bird species in the county. So what do we do? Well, I'm not going to talk all about this, but it's on our website. We have 4 main goals of our strategic plan, and we are in year 3 of that right now. We can just keep going.
Okay.
So education is one of our main goals. And some examples of what education projects we do include bird walks and field trips. It's open to everyone. We would love to have whoever's on this webinar come and join. They will resume at the end of the summer. We also have Eyes in the Sky live raptor visits. And if you've been to the backyard aviary at the Museum of Natural History, you've seen our birds. They also go to classrooms. For example, we have a signature classroom program for K through 3 grades that go to local schools. It's called Meet Your Wild Neighbor. And we have an experienced bird handler, and the live raptors will go. And we have a set curriculum, which is aligned with next generation science standards. And we bring birds there and we teach about protecting birds. We also have the annual bird count for kids, which is in January at Lake Los Caneros, and evening programs every month. Generally, they are the 4th Wednesday of each month, and you can find out more information on our website. We also have outreach to other schools beyond Meet Your Wild Neighbor and retirement communities and other venues, such as the library. Different libraries, public, Santa Barbara and Goleta Library. We really believe in collaborations because we believe that working together, we are stronger in protecting birds. So just some examples of collaborations are listed here: the Museum of Natural History, Wildling Museum of Art and Nature, UCSB North Campus Open Space. In fact, tomorrow night, there'll be a free screening of Bringing Back Our Whatland at the Marjorie Luke Theater. There'll be a panel discussion afterwards with Lisa Stratton and Carla D'Antonio and other people, and the filmmaker, Michael Love. And if you want, you can attend that. Just register ahead of time. We also work with the Land Trust, Oriole Hundo, Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. We just did Bird Month with them last month, the Public Library in Santa Barbara and Goleta, and of course, this webinar. Some other examples of outreach. Oh, go ahead. Some other examples of outreach. This one I absolutely love. We have now a regular birding column in the Independent by our member, Hugh Ranson. If you haven't yet read it, just Google it or email me and I'll send you some of the links. He is an incredible photographer and writer and birder. So every month the Independent collaborates with us and he writes the articles. So thank you, Hugh. We also have conservation science letters that Jesse will talk about more. We have news that we put out. We have e-news, which comes regularly. And then we have El Tecolote, which is a newsletter that you can read online or get quarterly by mail. And that's a benefit of being a member, which you can do for $26 a year. We also, of course, do Earth Day. So some examples for anyone who's new to Santa Barbara Audubon Society, and I can't see faces on the webinar, it's a little tricky, but some examples of what we have protected or who we have worked with to support community protection in the past are Lake Los Caneros Natural Preserve, Moore Mesa, Douglas Family Preserve, North Campus Open Space, and recently the San Marcos Foothills Preserve. And so we're just part of a collective of community organizations that work very hard to protect open spaces, because with the open spaces, we can protect birds. So Jesse's going to go into this in detail. I'm not going to go into it, but I just want to highlight that our Conservation Science Committee is so talented. It's filled with researchers and birders and ecologists like Jesse, and they meet with agencies, they submit letters, they work every day to protect riparian habitats, for example. So we work to protect the purple martin and snowy plover. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them at the end of this talk. And that's sort of it for my part. Yeah, I just want to now pass it over to Jesse, who's going to do a deep dive on some of the conservation science work of Santa Barbara Audubon Society.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. But before we leave this introduction section, did we mention the Christmas bird count? Was that in one of our slides earlier? So would you like to mention that? Sure.
So we also help with the Christmas bird count, which is an annual tradition, and Audubon chapters do it across the nation. And we have a dedicated team of people who lead it and they organize it, and we would love to have you involved. So just check our website closer to December, and then all the details about how to sign up and register and involve are there.
Yeah, and I should mention that Santa Barbara is almost always in the top 5, I believe, of total numbers of birds seen throughout the US. Of course, it's not really a competition, but birders tend to get kind of competitive. And we routinely have over 200 species that are found. And that's largely in part to the kind of wide geographical, just the change in topography that we have here, from the channel to the coastal plain. We have the mountains, and then we have the backcountry that the Christmas bird count circle reaches into. So we really cover a lot of different types of habitat. And I really recommend, if anyone's interested in getting into the kind of the fun and the competition of the Christmas bird count, it's really a great activity. And there's also circles in Carpinteria and up north, like Kachuma has a circle, and so on. So that's, we're not even halfway through the year, and there's already really exciting things to be looking forward to later on. But speaking of exciting things, I'm going to talk a little bit now about the Breeding Birds Survey, which is a major citizen science project of Santa Barbara Audubon, and it's led by Conservation Science Committee members. And it's a pretty thrilling project, because we are taking observations from just about anyone who observes birds exhibiting breeding behavior, and I'll go into that in a second on what that actually means. But anyone is free to contribute to this effort. We have so far nearly 11,500 observations in our database. That's 193 species with breeding records in Santa Barbara County. And there's more than 320 contributors so far. The web map and ArcGIS is hosted out at UCSB at the Cheadle Center for Biodiversity and Ecological Restoration. And you can easily link to that from our website, and we can share that in the notes, or if someone asks, perhaps we can do that afterwards. So here, just quickly, this is a screen grab of all the observations from the Breeding Bird Survey so far. So you can see that it includes the 3 Channel Islands in addition, and you might notice some patterns on this map, which I'll get into in a little bit. And you can also see there's some large areas, which are basically wilderness areas that's a little hard to get into. But if anyone would like to go on a long distance backpack and get some breeding observations for us, you can join a very small and elite number of people who are out there doing that, maybe even as we speak. So as I was just mentioning, from this map, we can see some patterns in distribution of the breeding records in our county. And this is driven not only by bird behavior and bird distribution themselves, but basically it's where people live and where people are. We also have more records in areas that are popular parks and open spaces that have good access. People also tend to target areas of good habitat, such as riparian corridors along several of our creeks where there's good public access. And then another pattern is that we tend to try to highlight areas that are especially important when we think about conservation here, especially along the South Coast. There's a number of projects in the works or things that we know are coming along for development within the city of Goleta and Santa Barbara County. And so those are areas that we tend to go out and target because we want to build up this kind of baseline of data before these projects come into play. And then also because the data that we're collecting can be used to help decision makers modify the project to be more friendly to birds. So let's see. You might be wondering, well, what is a bird breeding behavior and how do I know it when I see it? If you go to our website, there's a very clear, there's a document with very clear information on the various types of things that we record in our database, but I'll just go over a few of them right here. Mostly we're just looking for interactions generally between two birds, so a pair of birds that hint at their behavior being related to mating. So you might see the birds mating. Well, that's kind of a giveaway. You might see them carrying sticks around or actually building a nest. Later on, you might see the birds sitting on a nest. Well, that's a pretty good indication that they're actually breeding when you actually see them sitting on a nest. Unfortunately, that's one of the things that we see the least often, unless it's a very large and noticeable bird like a red-tailed hawk. And that's because birds really do not want to be seen when they're nesting. They are very wary about predators, especially humans, getting anywhere near them. And so they tend to be extremely wary. And if you see a bird in the act of heading towards the nest and that bird sees you, they often double back and then they sit and wait somewhere until you've moved on. So actually looking for nests and finding nests is actually fairly difficult. And so that's why we use a lot of these other behaviors kind of in concert to indicate that there is a bird breeding event going on. We can look at with some of the raptor species, one bird may be on the nest while the other is out hunting. Then they'll do what we call a prey transfer, where the one bird that is just successfully hunted will transfer that prey animal to the other bird. Sometimes they come off the nest for that, sometimes not. Often we can hear calls and vocalization from the pairs of birds, and that will lead us to understand that there's a breeding event that's happened. You can often hear nestlings, young birds, making a very high-pitched noise. And actually, that's a really good way to find a nest or kind of pinpoint in the area of where a nest may be, is when you actually hear the super high-pitched little squeaky noises. Often the pair, the male and female pair, will fly together, either before or after the actual mating event. And they will definitely defend the nest and the territory. And even some of our smallest birds will do this really ferociously. I've seen hummingbirds try to defend a nest, and they definitely defend their territories. In my yard, in fact, there's scrub jays defending a nest and a territory. And so once you watch birds for a fair amount of time, you start to see what behaviors are just their kind of normal day-to-day behaviors, and then what behaviors might actually be something special, like they're actually protecting a nest or a territory. Finally, we have a category called just hanging out, and that's where, you know, you might see a pair of birds like the two kites in this picture. They're just kind of hanging out. Well, they might be doing some of these other behaviors as soon as you turn your back. Like I said, the birds are pretty sneaky and they don't really like to be watched. And so we have to be pretty sneaky while we're watching them also. Okay, so I wanted to give you some examples from the bird breeding study. I'm not going to go through all 11,000 records, but I'm going to show you some that are of particular interest to our Audubon chapter and to our conservation committee in particular. So I'm just going to jump right in here to North County. This is the one example I'm going to give from North County. This is Nahokwee Falls County Park. And you can see the outline of the park is basically splattered with these orange dots. Each one of those dots is a breeding record. And this is a great park to go to. It's a great park for birding. There's good parking. It's a real nice place to walk around. And that park actually supports some really spectacular old growth sycamore trees. These trees are really important for a type of bird. It's our largest swallow called a purple martin. And there was a really beautiful picture of a purple martin a few slides back that David Levasheff, I believe, had taken. And I'm sorry, I didn't repeat that picture again in here. But these birds are, they've reached kind of a critical low in their population. They used to be fairly common. And over the last 50, 60 years, their numbers have really been declining. Now, the purple martins that we have here on the West Coast are a different population. It's a different race than the purple martins that folks have on the East Coast. On the East Coast, those birds have successfully learned how to mate in artificial structures and in gourds that people hang out, like in their homes, like in their front yards, and the birds will come and use those artificial structures or martin houses to breed in and to have their nests in. And the reason why that's important is that these birds would typically nest in old growth forest, and they need cavities in trees. And especially in the very fire conscious climate that we're in, a lot of these kind of old growth trees and trees with dead limbs and trees with cavities are not really allowed to stay in place, and they are getting cut down. And so the birds are losing that habitat. Now, the birds on the East Coast have adapted to birdhouses, but our West Coast population has not. And so they are still reliant on these old growth trees. And the only known breeding location in Santa Barbara County for purple martins is at Nahoqui Falls Park. And right along the road, right along Alisal Road and kind of on the main entryway into the park, there are some of these giant old sycamore trees that have these cavities in them. Now, not every record that you see on this map is a purple martin. In fact, there's a wide variety of other birds that nest here as well. But the martins really got our attention because there are some of our members who have been monitoring their population for a couple of decades, and we know exactly which tree the birds are going to come back to year after year. And in the last few years, we've lost a number of those trees. And it's really it could be a severe problem for the martin population, because the bird's very faithful to an area and they'll return to that area. But then if that tree is gone, they don't have much recourse, because there's only half a dozen or so trees in this area that are actually supporting those birds. So there's opportunities here at this park to conserve the existing trees and also to try to restore some sycamore habitat. We've been working with the county parks management to try and change the kind of vegetation management scheme at this park to allow suckers to grow up from some of these really old sycamores, so that when the main stem of the tree dies, there's newer stems that are coming up. That's typically what a sycamore will do, but often in a park setting, those trunks get cut away. So we're working with parks to try to make that happen, but there's an ongoing need for this. And let me just show you the next slide here. The reason why I said there's an ongoing need for work in this way is that a main competitor with purple martins are the European starling, which is a bird that's been naturalized here from Europe. They use the same type of habitat. Actually, starlings will nest in a lot of different places, but they really like cavities. Thankfully, the breeding periods of the two different birds overlap a little bit, but they're somewhat distinct, so that European starlings come in and really hit the kind of the height of their breeding activity around May, and then they start to taper off. Purple martins are really late arrivers. They're coming up from down in the Amazon, actually, and so they've flown all the way up from South America, and they're showing up now in the end of May, but then they really don't get started full on nesting until June, mid-June, and into July. I just heard that for the first time, one of the first times ever, some of our members have observed some interactions, negative interactions between purple martins and starlings at Nahoqui, where there's starlings currently occupying the cavities that the martins want to use, and the martins are being very persistent, and they're trying to drive the starlings out. And if anyone's watched starlings, you know that they in themselves can be extremely noisy and persistent. And so it's going to be really interesting to see whether the martins will win out in this round. Okay, so stay tuned on the purple martin story. Hopefully things will get better for them. But it's because of the breeding bird study that we have been able to collect the data that is being really useful in our ongoing discussion with county parks. Okay, so the next bird I'd like to kind of quickly highlight that it's important here in Santa Barbara County is the yellow warbler. This is considered a species of special concern both by the Department of Fish and Wildlife and also by Santa Barbara County. It's a migratory songbird. It spends its winters down in Central America, then flies up here. Back as even 60, 80 years ago, they were common. And then their numbers really started to plummet. These warblers are listed when development plans are being put forward as a potential trigger for, say, more environmental studies, like maybe an EIR. But they're so rare now that many of our creeks and riparian areas don't have obvious yellow warbler breeding. Let's see, I think the next slide. Here we have 95 records in the bird breeding study of yellow warblers breeding in Santa Barbara County. We know that they probably breed more than this, but we just haven't been able to document it. If you can see, they're mostly along kind of our major rivers. They are mostly riparian birds. They like willow habitat. They will breed or nest in other types of habitat, but they really like it to be wet, near water. Unfortunately, along the coast, most of those areas have been developed, or the land has been converted to agriculture. And the inset picture I have, the blue arrow is pointing to one yellow warbler breeding record that we have on Atascadero Creek. And I have actually referred to this record a couple times now, and I've written comment letters on development that is poised to happen kind of around the Goleta Slough and just kind of to the southeast area, the south or east of the airport. That's also kind of in this slide here. So I know firsthand that these records are extremely important to draw attention to the importance of this habitat that these birds really need. Okay, so I'm going to move right along. Here's an example of our bird breeding study data in just South County. So I'm just bringing it back to the South Coast here. And you can see that there's some areas that really tend to get a lot more looks than others. And this is primarily because these areas are the best habitat that we have left. These are our large open spaces. We have, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but over on the left side, we've got the Elwood Mesa. We've got North Campus Open Space, which has recently been restored. And we're really pleased with how well that's, how nice of a habitat that's becoming for birds. We've got the area around Colo Point Natural Reserve. We've got out at UCSB, the Campus Lagoon, and this is the South Coast Important Bird Area, which National Audubon designated as a special area just because of migratory birds stopping through and needing these wetland areas. We also have Lake Los Carneros, which is just north of the freeway in the middle of Goleta. That's a really important area. We have more Mesa, which is also a very important area. And then we have San Marcos Foothills. And then you can see a few other kind of patches where the bird breeding records are really following these streams and riparian areas. Okay, so let's zoom in on San Marcos Foothills. And so here we are. You can see the kind of the grasslands, the boulder area, and then all the way over to the eastern mesa. Eastern part of San Marcos Foothills. And you can see a lot of these records are really along the kind of riparian corridors. We have 188 breeding records in this area, 48 different species. And I just wanted to highlight that ground nesting species are of important interest here due to the unique kind of grasslands of that north parcel. And some of the birds that are ground nesters that we have documented in this area are California quail, lark sparrow, mourning dove, rufous crowned sparrow, and grasshopper sparrow. And of this list here, the two that are kind of the most interesting and the most important are both the lark sparrow and the grasshopper sparrow. And that's because both of those have not been found to breed there in the past 20 years. So when the land switched away from being grazed by cattle, the vegetation type changed a bit to be more weedy, with thicker mustards. And these birds really like to build nests right on the ground up against like a bunch grass or some type of kind of more bunching grass than our kind of wild oats. And so we're hoping that with kind of new land management and new grazing regimes using the sheep and other techniques there, that the grasslands will get restored and these birds can come back. So that is our hope with that area. Okay, the next slide I'm going to go to. This is a really great example of what some public access can do for our knowledge about how important habitat is. On the right side of North Los Carneros, we have Lake Los Carneros County Park, which is just a mecca for birds and birders. And on the west side of Los Carneros, we have the Bishop Ranch, which is the largest privately owned property kind of in the middle of the Goleta Valley that we don't have access to for birding. So we don't know what birds are using this property now. We can imagine that some raptors are using it for foraging, but other than a couple of observations that we've been able to make from Cathedral Oaks, we really don't know. And it would be nice to think that this area is actually serving as some undisturbed habitat for some of our animals. But there's been some recent activities out there, like some disking that occurred a year or so ago that has the potential to really be disruptive for not only birds, but for small mammals and reptiles and that sort of thing. So for now, the Bishop Ranch is kind of it's a really large area, but it's kind of a black box as far as the habitat value. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about a program that we have called Kite Watch, and this is it's nested within the breeding bird study, which is why I'm going to talk about it now. But this is a targeted, a real focused look on white-tailed kites. And you're probably familiar with seeing these birds. They have a very kind of unusual particular foraging strategy where they kite. A couple other raptors do that also, but they have this kiting behavior while they're looking for their small mammal prey. And over the decades, like so many of our other birds, these kites have almost disappeared from the South Coast entirely. Now, a few years ago, we did actually have some successful nesting seasons and successful nesting behavior in a number of locations, but then with this drought, the numbers have really dropped off. So that's why this Kite Watch program is really important. And I'm kind of pumping this here because we do this year round. It's not just during breeding season, but if anyone would like to get involved, I just want to kind of quickly go over what this is all about. We try to figure out how many active territories there are. We document the timing of the nesting, whether the nests succeed or fail, how many chicks there are, if they fledge, whether the adults have another nest. Sometimes kites can have 2 and 3 nests in a season if there's enough prey species for them. We document the type of tree that they use, and then we continue into the non-breeding season and we look at roost locations and the number of kites. And in some years, we can have these aggregations of all of the birds. So all the young birds and the adult birds all congregate together in the fall, and we can have numbers of up to 20 or 30 kites at one time. And it's a really spectacular scene. And we've had that happen at More Mesa and a couple other areas. Unfortunately, not for the last few years. Just quickly, this is how some of the data that we've put together from the breeding bird study and from Kite Watch, these overlapping polygons show foraging areas that are within breeding territories for pairs of kites. And the reason why this is important is that because these are centered around these large open spaces that I mentioned earlier. So on the upper right, we have San Marcos Foothills area, and then you can see More Mesa down below that, and then the areas around the airport, which also include Lake Los Carneros, an area around the high school, Dos Pueblos High School, and then the Colo Point, North Campus Open Space, Elwood area. This is pretty much it for kites because they're really dependent on a type of vole, like a small mouse-like animal that really prefers to live in moist grasslands, and we've lost most of our moist grasslands. So the kites are dependent on these animals, and As the voles population declines, so do the kites. So this is just some of the information we collect with Kite Watch. And if anyone wants to join this program, I'm happy to walk you through all the steps of it. We also, I've made some pretty easy forms for this, so we make it as easy as possible. I should just mention this lower picture here on the left is showing something called whitewash. And this is actually a really good indicator of either a bird roost or a bird nest being directly above this. And you can imagine, well, I'll just tell you, the white stuff is guano. You might not want to stand in this location for too long, but there's probably a nest up above that somewhere. And it can be a really good tip to find some of our larger birds. And the upper picture, there's a white-tailed kite giving me the kind of evil eye because she knows I'm watching her. Some of our data from 20 plus years ago has been very helpful in kind of elucidating how the kites can have multiple broods in 1 year. So this was from quite a while ago, but they still, in good years, they still do this. The pair will start a new nest while they're still caring for fledglings. So the female bird will start a second nest, she'll mate, and then she'll lay eggs and incubate those eggs as the male is trying to wean off the fledglings from the first brood. And again, this is how this is some of the information from our breeding bird survey. Here's some more information that kind of goes hand in hand with some land use patterns. So this is the area around San Antonio Creek. Tucker's Grove is down to the left. San Marcos Foothills is on the right-hand side. On the other side of this would be 154 here. But this is just an example of how habitat has really become more constricted for these birds, for white-tailed kites. So there used to be pairs of white-tailed kites that would successfully nest along San Antonio Creek. And then this is, here it is 25 or so, actually 35 years later. And many of the open areas that were here have now been filled in with housing. And I've circled a couple of these that have gotten filled in the last 10 or so years. And we haven't had any successful breeding events happen in this watershed since 2010. And we do believe that that's in part due to the loss of this kind of what was kind of open grassy habitat that has been filled in with housing. We have observed birds flying in the past across 154 over to forage at San Marcos Foothills and come back, but in recent years, we haven't seen that at all. So unfortunately, this is the type of thing that's been happening throughout Goleta Valley, that as our residential areas get infilled, unfortunately, it's just cutting away, chipping away at the habitat that some of our bigger birds need for foraging. So like I said, there's been a recent breeding decline in kites. Just a few years ago, we had at least 8 successful nests in the South Coast, along the South Coast. And then last year, as far as I know, there was no breeding success. There may be 1 or 2 pairs this year, but I have not seen them. And so if anyone has any information on kites, we really want to know. So please contact us if you do. And as I said, like, continued development is encroaching into the foraging territories, and then that's combined with this extreme drought leading to the prey population failure. And this brings up the idea of trying to restore vole populations. And this is something that one of our kind of founding conservation committee members, Mark Holmgren, has really been trying to champion, is the idea that these small mammals don't travel very far, and the areas that they're in they're getting smaller and smaller as development happens around them. There's little or no connectivity between these remaining grassy open spaces. And with climate projections potentially creating more drought and more heat, seems like the vole population is going to have a really hard time recovering in these small areas, especially if you get one kite sitting over one grassy area and then eating all the voles in that area, and then the next grassy area that can support the small mammal is, maybe miles away. We may never get voles coming back. So the idea is that perhaps we could consider a captive rearing project where we rear these small animals and then we release them back into the remaining open areas so that they can continue to go through their population kind of boom and bust cycles, but don't ever get locally extirpated. And that way they can continue to serve the birds and the other animals that depend on them. I finally just want to say, well, not finally, but I just want to say, you know, our urban neighborhoods can really support breeding birds as well. And one of the patterns that I definitely noticed immediately when I was looking at our database earlier this week was that there seems to be these hotspots throughout our urban neighborhoods. And then I quickly recognized that these are just, all these dots are areas around a particular birder's home. So there's a particular birder that lives in this neighborhood. He doesn't have to go anywhere fancy. He just walks outside and, you know, takes a walk around the block and captures records for our database. And this one on the upper right, actually, this happens to be my neighborhood. And I've done the same thing where just from my backyard or just down the street, I've managed to collect some valuable information. And there's 26 species of common birds that have been found breeding just between mine and this other contributor's neighborhoods. And this information is also really important because there's constant threat to birds in our urban forests from tree trimming and tree care that occurs quite often. So not only street trees that our cities are in charge of maintaining, but also just people landscaping their yard or taking out a hedge or, you know, removing some bushy vegetation. Birds are constantly at threat from this type of activity. And the one map that I didn't really get a chance to show you is that if you could just look at our south coast, we have the Los Padres National Forest, and then immediately south of that, we have agricultural lands, which are highly modified. There's bait boxes put out in those areas to control rodent populations that might be affecting the trees or the orchards. And so those areas are almost like biological wastelands because of that. And then you just immediately come down into people's homes where there's this increasing push for fuels management, which is basically removing all native vegetation. And it's a hard push for animals to survive in this. And I know, you know, there's been kind of a thought, well, can't the bird just go somewhere else? But in our community, it's like there is no somewhere else for these birds. These birds have they have evolved to come to Goleta South Coast to breed, you know, over tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, and they're still programmed to come back to these areas. And when they do come back, they find that their tree has been cut down, or, you know, there's a new development in that open space. And this is really just why I think protection of our large open spaces is so critical, and the ability to restore these areas. And, you know, I mean, not just riparian corridors, but also grasslands like at San Marcos Foothills, and, you know, old growth sycamore up at some of our parks up in North County. There's a real need for that. And just to kind of wrap up my section here, I just want to put in a plug for our Conservation Science Committee. And we spend a lot of our time thinking about how birds are being affected, how birds might be affected, the different threats that are on the different types of habitat. And then we've been also spending a lot of time trying to build partnerships with our local cities and the county so that we can be working with the people that are caring for the land instead of against them kind of at the last moment. And I'm really happy that we've got a great relationship with the city of Goleta, and they try to bring us in early on projects and try to get our input and our feedback, and they're using data from the bird breeding study, bird breeding survey, and to help manage their properties. And the Elwood Mesa is actually a really good example of this, where there's going to be a big push to restore the butterfly grove. And a good part of that is removing some of the dead and dying eucalyptus that are out there, planting newer eucalyptus species, and then also bringing in thousands and thousands of native plants, native trees, native shrubs, and annuals. And I think the project it's going to turn out to be a great project. In years to come, there may be some just a little bit of disruption in the next couple of years, but the Conservation Committee has been we've been active at trying to collect data like this breeding season to feed that to the city of Goleta's team so that they can adapt what they're doing to work around. Like if we have a specific tree where there's woodpeckers nesting, they are committed to working around that tree, and so on. So I think the work that we're doing is really critical. It seems like it never ends. There's certainly lots to go around. So if anyone would like to join us, please do. Please come to our monthly Zoom meetings. We can send you an invite if you like. And also, we just welcome any or all bird breeding observations. So again, please check out our website. And if you need any help on knowing what to collect, let us know. And yeah, we welcome your interest and we welcome your involvement. And thanks everyone for being interested in conservation here in Santa Barbara, especially thanks to CIR. Yeah, so I think we just have a couple more slides here if you want to jump in, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessie. And I just want to, again, reinforce that this breeding bird study is so critical. I come from a science background, so having actual evidence to communicate the importance of protecting open spaces for our breeding birds is critical. So thanks to Jessie and Mark Holmgren and Adrian and a huge team of people who collect these records and then articulately summarize the results to give to decision makers, because that's what's going to protect our space. So thank you. What's next? Well, we're continuing to grow our Audubon community, so please join for $26 a year. We are continuing to expand our outreach and education. You can contact me if you have questions about that. And we will continue our conservation and science work. So how can you get involved? Well, as I just said, join Santa Barbara Audubon Society, stay informed. I mean, that's the best thing we can do is really just be more and more informed. Thank you, Jessie, for talking about the species of special interest tonight. You can receive El Tecolote, which is our quarterly newsletter, and eBlast. Just go ahead and join on our website or email us. Grab a friend and do a bird walk. And I've been doing that with my involvement in Santa Barbara Audubon Society. And I have to say, it's just such a pleasure. I've been going to North Campus Open Space and Lake Los Caneros. And you know, I learn a lot, it feels good, you have fun, so do that. And if you want to volunteer, as Jessie said, you can join the Conservation Science Committee. We currently need an education chair on our board. And if you don't want a board position, but you like to organize events, email me or the president, Jenna Levasheff, because that would be really helpful. Last few things. Thank you so much. As Jessie said, I just want to reinforce that. Thank you to our board. Thank you to our staff, our volunteers and students for your time, passion, and great work. Thank you so much to our donors and members, our grantors and photographers. In particular, Jessie, thank you for sharing your photos. Thank you to David Levasheff, we used the bulk of his photos. Glenn Kincaid, his name has 2 N's and it's spelled with a C, the last name, and he provided the Purple Martin photo, so thank you. And also Charles Kagara and Jeff Hansen for giving us photos for this presentation tonight. I also want to thank Channel Islands Restoration again. And that's pretty much wrapping it up. I see there's some questions, so Ken, Jessie, and I can go ahead and answer those. We like questions, and thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jessie and Catherine. And feel free to put more questions in the Q&A, folks. As I go through, I've got 3 here. Actually, a 4th from somebody who just joined, which was interesting. So we'll get to that in a moment. But first, I wanted to say that I'm glad you mentioned the grazing at San Marcos Foothills. I think it's important to note that that's a very expensive program. We spent already $30,000, and that was a highly discounted, about a 50% discounted rate, just doing an initial grazing in January and February. And then we'll have, let's see, Catherine's on the Q&A there, good. We'll have some more grazing that'll be paid for by the Santa Barbara Fire Safe Council later in the year. So that'll be good. But I just mentioned that because you folks, often a lot of you who are on this webinar tonight are members of CIR, and you know that we talk about the San Marcos Foothills a lot, and that we helped save the West Mesa with a coalition from development, which is the grassland they were talking about. And you can see now why we're, as the British would say, on about it all the time. because these folks will show you, with a breeding bird survey and with many, many years of knowledge, how important that property is for our local bird population. So, by the way, when you start talking about captive breeding of voles, keep us in mind. We would definitely be interested in doing anything we can to attract back kites there that used to breed on the property, even in my memory, on the eastern side of the property, but haven't recently. So if I know there are California voles there, and but there's probably not very many, and we'd be more than glad to participate in a research project along those lines.
Yeah, that's great to know, because we do have one of our most active conservation committee members is a UCSB professor who has like 30 years experience working with voles. And I've read other studies where I believe it was the Amargosa Valley vole out from the far eastern part of the state was saved from extinction by captive breeding and then re-releasing. So this is something we've been talking about a lot this past year. So maybe this is, a great opportunity for a partnership here.
Yeah, I think it's a great site for this. So on the West Mesa in particular. Very good. And let's go to the 3 questions that I have here. And again, folks, feel free to jump in with some more. But Susie Bartz, a former board member of CIR, and she asks, I think I saw birdhouses at Lake Los Caneros. This is a fascinating program for kids who visit there. How are the bluebirds doing?
So I can just give a little bit of summary about most recent work there, because it's pretty exciting. Right now they're breeding. As of May 14th, which is 2 weeks ago, there were 14 boxes, I'm just looking at my notes, currently being used by the tree swallows, and 2 boxes being used by western bluebirds. So that may have changed. And right now, actually, they are banding the birds to look at patterns over time. I would love to just give a shout out to Don Schroeder and Steve Senesek and a huge team of volunteers who lead this project. This is an example of community science work that is being driven 100% by volunteers. So that's why I included the slide. And they have collected over 17 years of data. There's a recent report of 10 years of data synthesis, which I can share. So again, my email, Maury put my email in the chat box, but if you want to, I can share the 92-page PDF that Steve Senesek and Don Schroeder sent me a couple months ago. I'd be happy to, but Jesse can maybe answer over general time how the western bluebirds are doing.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that both of those birds are cavity nesters, which means that by habit, they would nest in holes in dead trees or in dead limbs. And just because of our human development, there's far fewer of those trees existing in nature. I do have to say there's a street tree on my street that had bluebirds nesting in it 2 years ago, but that cavity has gone unnested in the past couple of years. So that's really where the boxes can fill in for areas. So we can have those birds continue to come to our part of Goleta and our part of California. But really what we'd like to do is think about a future where that type of habitat actually exists in nature for those birds, because it's not only bluebirds and swallows, but the purple martins that I mentioned earlier, and then there's other birds too, like oak titmouse and just woodpeckers. A whole variety of woodpeckers need cavities in trees and tree limbs. And I do have to say, though, that at Lake Los Carneros, the city of Goleta has been very good at allowing some of the older pine trees that died a number of years ago to stand. And I know that a couple of months ago, there were some woodpeckers that were trying to set up shop in one of the trees. I'm not sure whether that nest has been successful or not. But just from a conservation perspective, this is the kind of place where it is really helpful for us to step in when that habitat no longer exists in nature, but ideally that habitat would exist in nature. The other thing that we talk about, I'm just going to say one more thing about the boxes, is that we kind of struggle with the idea of how much publicity we want on site around the boxes. We would really like to educate folks about what the boxes are for, and the need for the birds to have that type of habitat, and maybe be able to get people involved in it. But we're also concerned about drawing too much attention to them and running the risk of having someone vandalize them or damage the birds in their nests. So we've been talking about some interpretive signage for nest boxes that might occur, at that particular location. It might be out near the stow house somewhere, or near the parking lot, that just mentions this is what the boxes are for, but doesn't actually draw attention to the boxes in the location of where they actually are mounted.
Yeah, good point. So Susie also asked regarding the breeding birds survey and popular parks, how do you avoid duplicate data? For instance, if more than one observer reports the same bird behavior.
Aha. So yeah, so this is something that we do track. One of the ways is that there's a number of fields, which I'm not going to take the time to pull up the data input form right now, but you're required to give a GPS location. And then we do have quality control on this end. So we have people who go over these records when they're submitted, and each record gets a number, but then those breeding events are tracked, so that if someone submits a white-tailed kite nest on one day, and then later that afternoon, someone else submits a white-tailed kite nest, the quality control section on our end is like, wait a minute, these are in the same location, it's the same nest. Now that, when you start to get to more smaller common birds, there's not as much scrutiny paid to them. Like, let's just say a family of bush tits, where you've got fledglings following two adults that are busily feeding them, they could move over a pretty large area. And so we're not quite as worried of having two different groups of bush tit families within the same 100 square meters. When you get to bigger birds that have larger territories, that's when it becomes a little more obvious that people are probably talking about the same individual birds, especially birds that, like the big hawks, they'll start courtship behavior like in December and January for our red-tailed hawks, but then they won't start making a nest for a month or two later, and then they kind of take their time and stand around, and then they may not be fledging chicks until right around now, kind of in May. And I know there's red-shouldered hawks all over town that have just really cute, white, fluffy, half-grown chicks standing in the nests. I can think of several locations right now. Those are, we can sort it out on our end so that we're making sure there's not duplicates. We do encourage people to take photographs. And like I said, you do have to put in a GPS location. You don't have to take that GPS location when you see the bird. You can choose it on a map later on. But that's some of the ways in which we kind of ensure that we're not double counting.
Right. Yeah, very robust data. Good
Yeah.
tool. I've used it for the San Marcos Foothills a lot.
Mhm.
I forgot who asked this question, pardon me, but I think it was she asked if Santa Barbara Audubon, and then I think she's referring to CIR, are we involved in legislation, etc. She's asking because she's wondering if you are helping to fight against more development in the area. She's concerned with, very concerned with farmland areas, golf courses, etc., that are being talked about as potential new housing. I'll take from our point of view, of course, we're really proud of the work that we did to save the 101 acre West Mesa right in the nick of time from development, along with a big coalition of other folks. And we are part of the Watershed Coalition that mostly deals with the Goleta Valley area. And we're often asked to comment on proposals, and we'll often put our name along with many organizations on such things regarding development, particularly creek setbacks and things like that. So it's not our primary job, but I think Santa Barbara Audubon does more of that than we do. Am I right, Catherine or Jesse?
Well, I'll just go quickly. So we have to be a little careful about, supporting specific passage of laws, just since we are a 501c3, and so we have to be
Right.
careful with what we do with our activity along that line. However, we are very active in commenting on local development projects here, and we often write comment letters at all stages of a development proposal. And I was going to say that we did submit comments on the county housing plan, which is to meet the state housing mandates, where the on the county level, they were suggesting infilling, and I forget how many thousand, whether it's 3,500 or 5,000, I forget exactly the number of houses that they were suggesting putting into the South County, but many of them were are still slated to go to these, like the agricultural lands, South Patterson area, like San Marcos Growers area, like places now that are used for agriculture or are open. I believe that the golf course up by Dos Pueblos High School is also one of those areas where they're looking to put in more housing. And anything that's going to affect bird habitat is something that we feel very strongly about, and we write letters and we go to city council meetings and we contact our elected officials. Everyone has the right to do that. You don't have to be part of CIR or part of Audubon. Our elected officials love to hear from individuals, and they really like to get public comment. Now, whether or not that's going to be effective in slowing or stopping or modifying this housing mandate kind of remains to be seen. But it would be nice to think that we could be optimistic that there could be some good that could come out of it for a habitat perspective. Maybe we can get restoration of other areas. I'm trying to find some optimism here. Increasing urban density is it doesn't, it's not really good for anybody, environmentally speaking. I live in Old Town Toledo that's very crowded, and I would almost prefer to personally see like a multi-story building come up here along the Hollister corridor in Old Town than to convert our ag land, because even, the ag land south of Hollister is still being used by migratory birds. When the fields are fallow, birds go in there and forage. It's not the same as like perennial crops or orchard land, where those lands are being sprayed. There's, with baits and all of that. These areas do provide more habitat for birds. So, I think we would really prefer not to see any change in that regard, unless, of course, those areas were going to be fully restored to the riparian and wetland habitat that they used to be. But I can't see that happening unless some money from the 2030 projects come along. And Catherine, maybe you've got something to add to meet my pessimism.
You summed it up perfectly, Jesse. Thank you.
Okay, it's interesting, Jesse. We're all allergic to high-rise buildings in this area. We love the low-lying character. We can see the mountains, we can see the ocean, and etc. But it's, we're trying to pack so many people into a small area, and it's not stopping. Everybody wants to live here. Can you blame them? So I have to tend to agree with you. I'd rather see things move up a little bit than move out. But it's really a bigger question than we can take on right now. Vincent asked, and I'm not quite entirely sure what he's talking about here, but he says, what should the environmental health sector do to protect bird species? Vincent, if you can be a little more specific about your question, maybe type that in there and we can get an answer to that.
Well, I'm very interested
in
hearing what Vincent has to say. It's a really interesting question, and there's been a lot of news recently about the benefits of being out in nature and birding for cognitive strength and just emotional health and mental strength. So, I'd love to hear more questions, or also if Vincent wants to email Jesse or I offline, we're happy to discuss this further, because I think it's a really important question. And if there's a way to quantify, a little bit more details would help.
Well, and I could take that question from a different perspective, which is if you're thinking about bird health and environmental
Mhm.
problems such as like maybe the, avian flu H5N1 that has been detected in California condors. And I forget how many now have died from the bird flu, like 6 maybe, but it's a significant number. And so the folks that are managing those flocks are rapidly trying to vaccinate the remaining birds. I know that every year we do have problems with influenza and other like bird communicable diseases spreading through feeders. So if you do have feeders and bird like fountains in your yard, it is a really good idea to take those down periodically and sterilize them.
Yeah.
Especially, well, hummingbird feeders, I usually try to wash mine out, every few days. But I've seen house finches in my yard that have deformed bills from some of these bird viruses. And I actually had that transferred to my backyard chickens at one point several years ago. So it is a concern. And so if you're going to be feeding animals in your yard, you just have to make sure that it's as clean as possible. Take them down, bleach the feeders periodically, maybe weekly, or if in times when we do have these outbreaks. And I don't think Santa Barbara ever got as bad as other places in the state and in the country did this last year, but Department of Fish and Wildlife will send out notifications about these outbreaks, and then you just take your feeder down and the birds should be okay. They like to eat seed because it's easy for them, but it's probably better to stop feeding them for a week or two and let a bird, disease epidemic die down.
It's amazing. Most people are just completely unaware of the potential for disease spread through feeders. And I talk to people about it all the time. I said, do you sterilize your feeders? And a lot of people are just clueless. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, we're all, we're using masks and hand wipes and everything else ourselves, but
That's right. Let's see. Donna Sullivan said she missed the part about the kites sometimes having 2 nests simultaneously. Can you repeat that? And thank you for the great talk, she says.
Yeah, so it's not exactly simultaneously, it's more of an overlap. And we've seen this happen in the locations where there's enough prey. So like basically the open spaces that have the most prey species to support multiple broods. And so the way it goes is that the kites pair up, they make a nest, the female lays the eggs, and then they take turns incubating the eggs. And it's pretty cool watching it. I mean, one will sit for a while and then the other flies in and they get off and they switch. And then at some point, once the eggs hatch, it's like, over a couple of weeks while those babies are growing. And right when they're at the fledging stage, the female will often just kind of take off and look for a new place to make a nest. And you can see her like, off in the distance carrying sticks around while the male is left kind of dealing with these fledglings. And so there's that's what I was talking about, the overlap. And sometimes they'll even have a new nest already established and the female will be sitting on the eggs while the male is still trying to wean the fledglings, which are, full size, and they're still following him around, like complaining, going, feed us. And he's just like, I got a whole new family coming, but fend for yourself. And so a number of years ago, before this drought really set in, we had pairs of kites out at Moore Mesa that had 3 nests in 1 year, which was just amazing. They had successful fledges from that. And that just goes to show that, a large open space can have these vole populations to support that many hungry raptors. And it's not only the kites eating those mice and the voles, it's also red-tailed hawks, red-shouldered hawks, northern harriers, probably kestrels and other things if they could catch them, and foxes and coyotes and snakes, and there's lots of predators out there trying to eat those small mammals. But as I also said, we're pretty concerned that some of these smaller areas have lost connectivity with kind of reserves of voles, and so these smaller areas can just get all the prey can be getting eaten, and then how is that vole gonna like cross the freeway from Lake Los Carneros to get over to the area near the airport? You know, maybe thousands of years ago it would have been able to make that distance, but it's pretty unlikely now that one's gonna, you know, walk all the way over there by itself and make it. So that's why the idea of restoration comes in, especially as climate is becoming more and more uncertain, and we're getting potentially longer droughts or more extreme droughts, or then more extreme rain. Yeah, so, but the good news is the birds are resilient. I mean, the voles are resilient. The voles evolved to live in these periods of, you know, extreme cyclical nature, but they didn't evolve to do it where humans have developed the landscape. So that's really where we need to step in with, you know, the plans for restoration, is because the animals are resilient, but to a point. And it's at that intersection of our development and, you know, the kind of permanent changes we've made to the landscape that really tests how resilient they really are.
Great. Let's see. So Rose Silvas, speaking of voles, asks, are pesticides an issue for voles? And I said, probably.
Yeah, there's whole, like, I mean, if you start looking on the internet, there's like every pest control company in the US has a big picture of a vole, and like voles are one of the main things they say that their rodenticide goes after, because in some agricultural settings, I mean, they'll come in, they're just like, you know, they're little mice, they'll just come right in and nibble away at the crops. And so that's why they've been determined to be a pest. And there's countless, you know, ways to trap them, gas them, exclude them, bait them. And it's just, it's really sad. So yeah, I mean, the bait boxes that are left outside of businesses all over town, it's even, you know, especially I've seen ones that have been actually dragged away from wherever they were put. And or just by the side, I was at Halama County Park last week, and there was a bait box just like out in this oak grove all on its own. And it's like, did they put it there intentionally? Did someone pull it over there? But either way, it's killing the rodents that our larger predator species need. And I read a study recently where it was something crazy, like 87% or some really high number of owls and all the hawks they tested all have rodenticides in their blood, because they have been eating mammals that have these rodenticides in them. And that's when, you know, when you have an animal that's kind of at the top, a top predator, top of the food chain, they bioaccumulate those poisons, and maybe they can survive 1 or 2 feedings on a rodent that's been poisoned, but you know, there's going to be some critical load where they can't survive it. And I would love to see a campaign reducing rodenticide use. And this is something that our conservation committee has talked about. And we've had some people from down south, from Malibu, come up and give presentations to us on how they did it in their community. And the problem is, it's just like we need people, we need probably some money, we need to work with our elected officials, and we need to get past just kind of like the average public's fear that, you know, pests are going to just take over if we stop doing these things. And yeah, if anyone would like to join us on this effort, and I should just say our conservation committee it's an all volunteer effort, and it's made up of a lot of people who are either retired professional scientists. Some of them haven't retired. I'm not retired, actually. But, you know, we all have different levels of expertise and different levels of time, and anyone is welcome, especially if it's someone who's willing to put forward, you know, this type of plan. And I think really the only way that, like a way to modify rodenticide use or ban, or even try banning rodenticides and pesticide use, is to work amongst, like, have all the groups work together. So we, you know, Audubon could partner with CIR and, you know, just like a handful of other groups, so that we really have a lot of strength behind us when we go to our elected officials and try to get things changed. And if I could just say one more thing, Santa Barbara County, I think Santa Barbara City and Goleta City have sworn that they don't apply pesticides or use rodenticides, but the problem is that many of their vendors do. And so for the example of Arroyo Burro Beach Park, the county themselves do not control the rodents, but the people or the company that has the lease for the restaurant is allowed to put bait boxes around the restaurant. And this kind of, I just learned this a couple of years ago or last year when the county wanted to put up an owl box, because there's lots of, people excited about looking at owl cams and they wanted to do something good. And so they put up this owl box, but it's like 50 yards away from our rodent bait station. And I pointed this out to county parks, but until things change at kind of a, higher level, this is the kind of position that we're in. It's the same thing happens out at Lake Los Carneros with the Stowe House, where they have bait boxes, but because they have a special agreement with the city as a leaser, but the city in itself does not use bait stations.
That
So
stuff is absolutely nasty. It should be banned. I mean, anything we can do. Marla Cooper points out that Lake Casitas and the Channel Islands have bald eagles. Of course, they were reintroduced to the Channel Islands. But are there any areas in Goleta or in the general area that you know of where there's bald eagles?
Lake Achuma.
Oh, Lake Achuma, of course.
Yeah. And remember, bald eagles eat fish. So they have to be near large bodies of water or the coast where they can be gathering fish. But I have seen eagles fly over the Santa Ynez Mountains. I've seen them, I saw one perched on a lamppost at the side of the freeway near Rincon one time, just as I was driving along. There was one just sitting there. And they have pretty big territories, so they do fly around. But for nesting, I know Casitas right now, there's eagle nests, also Lake Achuma, and then of course on the islands as well.
Great. Vincent Hernandez chimed in again to clarify my environmental health question. I'm thinking about water quality since birds enjoy living / breeding near water. How should Santa Barbara County try to design their water systems to ensure bird protection?
Well, basically, if you're thinking about natural creeks, usually when the water's flowing, it's healthier. I think when the time that the water becomes a risk for animal health is if water's standing and is pooled, because you can get kind of overgrowth of some different types of algae that could be toxic. Also, you run the risk of having like infiltration from other sources into a pool of water, where like maybe from a septic tank or agricultural runoff that could have concentrated chemicals in it. I know that's a little bit of an issue in Atascadero Creek, potentially because of there's a number of springs kind of in the area that naturally would flow into Atascadero Creek, but there's also kind of concentrated agriculture in that area. So in some places we do see flow during the summer, and I haven't done any water testing there, but it'd be interesting to look at that water for various chemicals. It kind of depends on what part of town you're in, because there's different restrictions on what can be done. Whether you're in the coastal zone, the Coastal Commission has certain restrictions on applications of herbicide and that sort of thing. But then once you move slightly inland out of the coastal zone, cities and counties are allowed to do things that could affect water quality slightly differently, because then the Coastal Commission is out of the loop on that one. I see birds drinking from, water that from my neighbors washing their cars down the street. And I always wonder, are they going to be okay? And I think, a lot of smaller songbirds don't live that long. They'll live a few years. And I guess the question is, for some of these other, kind of like legacy pollutants, can the bird accumulate enough of that pollutant over its short lifespan to actually have a negative effect? Now, if it's something that could cause acute poisoning, like a toxic algal bloom or, herbicides or fertilizer runoff into a creek, that's definitely a problem. So, I think my answer to the question would be, we should be restoring natural stream function and natural flow. Unfortunately, that's a little difficult because county flood control is under a mandate to keep our coastal channels and stream courses open. And kind of like to convey as much water to the ocean as possible during these heavy rain events that we've gotten. So our streams are all pretty highly modified, especially on the bottom of the channel. And that's not always conducive for providing water flow kind of during lower flow times of year for birds and other wildlife. So I hope that helps. And we've talked about the idea of building like watering devices in areas that used to be spring fed, like parcels of land that used to have springs, but because of groundwater pumping don't have springs anymore. That's a possibility. I know that some of the parks we have leaking sprinklers, which have been allowed to drip, and then the birds can come down and drink out of them. At Stowe Grove, there's a master plan, a park master plan that's, I think, wrapping up. And having a bird watering feature was one of the ideas that was being put forth out there. But probably the best way is just to write to your elected officials and tell them that you really care and you want to see this thing happen.
Okay, well, I think I'm gonna wrap this up, but Maria Cooper is back. She says, my son is an environmental engineer for county flood control. Although he has to be concerned with flooding / water flow, he is also very concerned about wildlife. Great to hear it, Maria.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That's great to know.
Yeah. Hey guys, this has been wonderful. I just put in the chat a moment ago the address on our website for our webinars. This webinar, if you came in late, will be available on there in 2 or 3 days usually. And also there is a archive of all of our past webinars. So check it out. And thank you so much for joining us, Jesse and Catherine. You guys were awesome. Thank you. Round of applause. And we can't hear you all, but I can hear them all now, you know, so really excellent people. Really enjoyed it, I can tell. So thank you so much for joining us. And Maury, can you come on up and tell us what we have coming up next month? Or I'm putting him on the spot.
Yeah, thank you, Ken, and thank you, Catherine and Jesse. Next month we have James Yee from the Barbaño Chumash group, and he's going to be talking about the Barbaño Chumash language.
Yeah, that's going to be special too. So check that out because, well, I won't get into it, but you've got to check it out. But thank you, Catherine and Jesse.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Karen. Thanks, CIR. Okay. Good night.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.